March 6, 1914. Mr. Vanderbilt woke in a Washington hospital room, his condition deteriorating far faster than anyone told us. The master was 51, recovering from a supposedly routine appendectomy. The surgeons promised him it was a completely safe procedure with a very simple recovery. But something failed on that operating table. The fever spiked. The agony spread. By nightfall, our employer would be gone. 300 miles south in Asheville, our fortress stood waiting. The Biltmore estate. 250 rooms, the largest private residence ever constructed in America. He spent 6 brutal years building it, pouring millions into raising a grand French chateau right here in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I watched him fill those halls with priceless art, rare books, and European furniture. He secured 125,000 acres of land around us. He built an American palace that easily outshined the old world. But in mere hours, the entire burden would fall to his widow. Madam Edith was just 42, raising a 14-year-old daughter. She lacked legal training, entirely unprepared for the sheer devastation heading her way. The master's sudden passing triggered a massive financial collapse that nearly annihilated everything we maintained. Let's look at the timeline together. In October 1913, just months before his death, the government passed the federal estate tax. The Vanderbilts were about to become its primary target. I watched Madam fight the government for 15 agonizing years just to keep her own historic home, ultimately surrendering 90% of the great estate. 87,000 acres sold, treasured artwork auctioned, furniture scattered. The endless legal battles took years, and the financial toll was absolute. Even after she claimed victory, winning proved insufficient. The Great Depression forced one final tactical retreat that Mr. Vanderbilt would have found utterly unthinkable. This is the ground truth of how federal agents nearly seized Biltmore. How Our Lady fought federal collectors, losing nearly everything to secure the perimeter. She finally saved the property by executing a strategy her husband never permitted. She breached the gates, letting the public inside. If stories of historic survival command your attention, hit that like button and subscribe. We begin with the exact telegram that shattered our quiet world. Phase 1, March 6, 1914. The day our defensive line collapsed. Mr. George Washington Vanderbilt was born directly into American royalty on November 14, 1862. He was the youngest grandson of the famous railroad titan Cornelius Vanderbilt, who forged truly massive wealth. While his older brothers waged corporate warfare, our quiet master vastly preferred his library. He collected rare texts, studied architectural design, and swept through Europe gathering high culture. The master was a fiercely private intellectual, avoiding boardrooms entirely. When his father passed in 1885, the scholarly heir received roughly $10 million. Just a tactical fraction of his brother's inheritance, but it served his mission. He had absolutely zero desire to command railroads or conquer empires. His objective was establishing a permanent sanctuary, proving that American capital could engineer art just as magnificent as the European estates. He targeted Asheville, North Carolina, a mountain outpost offering cool climates and commanding sightlines. Then, the land acquisitions quietly began. By 1889, he controlled 125,000 acres of dense Blue Ridge forest and rugged farmland. He deployed legendary architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a French Renaissance chateau. We broke ground that very year, sustaining heavy construction operations for 6 solid years. A battalion of 1,000 men engineered 250 luxurious rooms. We secured a massive banquet hall, a 10,000-volume library, a pool, and even a bowling alley. Advanced central heating, electric lighting, and serious refrigeration machinery formed the most formidable private residence in the entire nation. Our commander occupied Biltmore on Christmas Eve, 1895. Unmarried at 33, he stood as master of a compound that cost $6 million to execute. For 3 quiet years, he held the estate alone, hosting select guests, surveying the timber, and operating as a dignified gentleman. Then in 1898, he married Miss Edith in Paris. A brilliant 25-year-old from Rhode Island, she brought true tactical grace to the house. Our reserved leader finally secured a partner who understood his grand operation. Their daughter, little Cornelia, was born right here in August of 1900. At 37, with Madam at 27, their position was secure. They commanded vast wealth, managing forestry logistics alongside the nation's top timber expert, Gifford Pinchot. The art reserves expanded. We reinforced the Grand Library. Every operational detail achieved perfection. He engineered his ideal existence. Highly cultured, completely isolated from the vicious corporate warfare his brothers fought. By March 1914, our employers were married 16 years. Miss Cornelia was 13, trained by private tutors. The family ran tactical shifts between our mountain stronghold and their Washington townhouse. The master was 51, displaying solid vitals. We had absolutely no reason to anticipate anything but decades more of the secure life he established. Then the abdominal pain started. A highly common vulnerability, rarely fatal if doctors intercepted the threat early enough. Washington physicians ordered immediate extraction. Appendectomies were standard protocol then, executed thousands of times a year. The casualty risk was supposedly non-existent. Our employer checked into the medical facility, prepping for a minor operation. The surgeons made their move in early March. At first, the perimeter seemed secure. He was recovering, scheduled to deploy back to Asheville within a fortnight. Then, severe complications breached the lines. We never received the exact medical briefing, but a critical failure occurred post-operation. A heavy infection, most likely. Internal hemorrhaging or surgical error. Back then, even basic procedures carried lethal threats we easily neutralize today. The master's vitals crashed fast. The fever surged, the agony multiplied. The medical staff deployed every countermeasure they had, but their weapons were useless. You and I know antibiotics were 15 years away. Their crude surgical tactics simply failed. Whatever system went down inside him, they could not repair it. On March 6, 1914, we got the terrible news. Mr. Vanderbilt died in a Washington hospital, just 51 years old. They said the cause was appendectomy complications. They brought the master back to Asheville for burial. Hundreds gathered for the funeral. Every paper reported it. The man who built this massive historic mansion was gone. He left behind his widow, a teenage daughter, and an estate nobody could even price. Mrs. Vanderbilt got the telegram here. At 42, she was suddenly left completely alone, holding responsibilities she hardly understood. The master always handled everything: the estate finances, the heavy legal matters, the operations. The madam focused on young Cornelia, hosting the grand parties and managing us servants. She knew this place took fortunes to run, but she had no clue the storm heading her way. Mr. Vanderbilt's will kept things very simple. Everything passed to her. This grand chateau, the sprawling land, the art, the library. 125,000 acres of mountains, 250 rooms to clean, every single painting and chandelier. She inherited our whole world and a crisis that almost broke her. See, just 5 months before the funeral, the federal government passed a fresh law, the estate tax. Any rich American dying after October 1913 had their holdings heavily taxed before families inherited anything. Rates scaled from 1 up to 10% based on size. For an estate packed with millions in property, that tax bill was brutal. The widow had to pay up before she could legally claim a dime. She didn't grasp the danger yet. Downstairs, we watched her focus purely on grieving, comforting Cornelia, and planning the funeral. The suits eventually explained the tax trap. We soon saw IRS assessors knocking on our doors. She quickly learned that holding America's largest private residence meant fighting the nation's newest, most aggressive tax collectors head-on. Let me show you how the battle for Biltmore began. 3 weeks after the funeral, we ushered the lawyers into the grand library. I served them tea while Mrs. Vanderbilt listened to what she actually inherited. The news sounded comforting at first. On paper, she was the wealthiest widow in America. In reality, she was practically broke. The grounds alone were worth several $1 million. Thousands of acres of North Carolina mountains and raw timber. This house and our furnishings added $2 million more. Real paintings by Renoir and Whistler. 16th century tapestries, old French chateau furniture, 10,000 rare books sitting right there on the shelves. Every room we dusted held museum-grade treasures. The total inheritance was estimated between $5 and $10 million. The suits couldn't give exact numbers since nobody ever formally appraised it. How do you price a massive chateau like ours? What's the fair market value for a home with zero comparable sales? Here was the terrifying catch. None of it was cash. The madam couldn't pay us with tapestries. She couldn't write checks backed by raw, uncut timber. Her wealth was entirely locked in hard assets. Selling them would take years. Meanwhile, she had immediate expenses demanding hard cash. Just keeping Biltmore running burned $50,000 annually. That only covered bare bones. 80 of us on payroll, from the butler down to the maids. We all needed wages, housing, and food. Our massive boilers ate tons of coal just to heat 250 rooms. The electric plant demanded fuel. The farmhands constantly needed seed. Maintenance never stopped. Roofs leaked, heavy pipes burst. A stone giant this size rots faster than you'd guess. Then came the local property taxes. The state taxed our land heavily every year. Add the massive insurance premiums for a multi-million-dollar property. Add forest upkeep. Add the grocery bills for the family and all us staff. The costs just spiraled. The madam only had about $100,000 in quick cash. Just the small bank accounts and bonds the master left behind for emergencies. That sounds rich, but we burned through that in under 2 years just keeping the lights on. Once she started selling things to survive, she probably could never stop. The lawyers revealed another nightmare. She inherited everything, sure, but that included all the master's debts. Every single dime owed when he died fell right onto her shoulders. Unfinished estate projects had to be built or canceled, bringing brutal fees either way. Existing contracts demanded completion. Every financial promise transferred to her. Even worse, the massive inheritance wasn't actually hers until the legal dust settled. That paperwork process would take years. Meanwhile, she had to pay us and maintain the place using her tiny cash reserves. The local courts held the inheritance hostage until she paid every tax, settled all debts, and cleared the hurdles. Picture the tension here. She was starved for cash despite owning millions. Upstairs, young Cornelia's expensive private tutors expected their paychecks exactly on time. Downstairs, our kitchen staff cooked daily for nearly 100 people. The tired gardeners still manicured endless rolling acres. Foresters ran massive timber crews needing constant oversight. Every single day, Biltmore chewed through money. And every day, the madam's cash shrank a bit further. She lacked business training. They raised her for high society, to arrange flowers, manage us servants, and raise a cultured daughter. She spoke beautiful French. She knew fine art and could host 30 aristocrats flawlessly. She never ran our payroll. She never battled timber buyers or harsh taxmen. That was the master's territory. Now, we all looked to her. Foresters needed orders on cutting timber. The farm managers begged for direction on our crop planning. I needed orders to keep the household running. Everyone downstairs assumed the madam knew what to do. She didn't. I watched her scramble, poring over the late master's files, meeting former advisors. She was desperately learning about massive enterprises she hardly knew existed before. Serving tea, I overheard the lawyers raise a new threat. Washington was sending federal assessors to value the entire estate for taxes. This stemmed from a nasty new law passed 5 months before the master died, the estate tax. The lawyers murmured about rates hitting 10% on massive inheritances. For a widow inheriting $5 to $10 million in property, the bill could easily top $500,000. And they demanded that $500,000 in hard cash. The payment was due within months. I heard them say Madam Edith held just $100,000 liquid. Where would she dig up $400,000 more? The only tactical move was selling timber, land, or maybe the fine art. But fencing masterworks takes time, and a rush sale would never fetch their true market value. She was being forced to tear apart the master's grand creation before she even finished mourning him. I heard the grieving widow ask the obvious question. Could she just hand it back? Refuse the inheritance? Walk away and let someone else untangle this impossible mess? The suits shook their heads. She had 14-year-old Miss Cornelia to support. The girl was the eventual heir, and walking away now left her with absolutely nothing. Besides, where would the family live? What could they do? High society women didn't work for a wage. They certainly didn't build careers. They managed grand households like ours, raised children, and survived on inherited wealth. Madam's entire existence was built on being Mrs. George Vanderbilt. That title meant nothing if she surrendered the massive estate attached to it. So, she decided to fight. She had no real choice, but she held no false hopes. The grand inheritance making her wealthy on paper was pushing her into incredibly desperate financial maneuvers. Let me tell you, America's absolute largest private home was becoming the country's heaviest burden, and my employer was learning that sometimes massive wealth is just a gilded trap. I saw the lawyers out that evening with strict orders: prepare for the assessors. Start flagging which assets we could liquidate fastest, hunt down buyers for timber we could log right away, and pray those federal agents valued the grand property on the low side. Because if Washington decided Biltmore was worth a fortune, the crippling tax bill might force Madam to sell the very house just to afford the right to inherit it. I left her sitting alone in the library, swallowed by 10,000 rare books the master spent decades collecting. Outside, 125,000 acres of mountain terrain rolled into the dark. Upstairs, Miss Cornelia slept in a suite larger than any normal family home. Yet in the bank, I knew she barely held enough cash to keep our staff and operations running for 2 more years. America's richest widow was practically dead broke, and the storm was just hitting. Chapter 3: The New Tax That Changed Everything. The lawyers explained that the 16th Amendment was ratified on February 3, 1913. It was just one single, lethal sentence. Congress now held the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from any source, without splitting it among the states or caring about population counts. That one sentence shifted American history forever, and it directly destroyed Madam Vanderbilt's peace. For over a century, Washington ran on trade tariffs and excise fees. Direct taxes on a man's personal income used to be strictly unconstitutional. The Titans paid almost nothing to the capital, since their fortunes grew from investments, not weekly wages. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and my employers, the mighty Vanderbilts. All those Gilded Age empires had multiplied mostly untouched by federal hands. Local towns collected property dues, but Washington stayed out. However, progressive reformers have been aggressively hunting for a system change since the 1890s. They claimed massive wealth threatened democracy itself. They said industrial monopolies were too bloated, and the canyon between masters and servants was tearing society apart. Their weapon of choice was taxation. Bleed the income, tax the sprawling estates, forced the elite to fund the very government shielding their mansions and maintaining their trade routes. The brutal amendment cleared Congress in 1912. By early 1913, enough states had fallen in line to officially ratify the strike. For the first time ever, the federal government possessed the tactical power to tax personal income. Congress struck fast. In October 1913, they pushed the Revenue Act through. It launched a tiered income tax, 1% on anything over $3,000, scaling to 7% past $500,000. The wealthy would finally pay. But hidden deep inside that exact same legislation sat another lethal trap: the estate tax. Picture this. When an American titan died, the government audited and taxed the entire estate before any heir could inherit. The toll started at 1% for estates over $50,000, scaling to 10% on anything breaking $500,000. Sure, it sounds light today, but back in 1913, this was an absolute shock to the system. It had never existed. For us working under the Vanderbilt roof, the timing was catastrophic. That fatal law dropped in October 1913. Master George died in March 1914. Just 5 months later, had he passed 6 months earlier, Madam Edith would have inherited the entire empire entirely tax-free. Washington couldn't have touched a penny. Instead, he perished right after the ink dried, making the grieving madam one of the very first targets in America's brutal new estate tax system. The new rules were engineered specifically to attack the massive wealth the master had built. Sprawling estates, heavy landholdings, priceless art, endless timber, everything defining a Gilded Age empire. Those progressives pushing the ink desperately wanted to shatter any chance of a permanent American aristocracy. They decided old money locked too much leverage inside too few mansions. This tax forced every new generation to buy back the privilege of holding what their fathers had built. So what does this mean for normal working folks like us? Nothing. Estates under $50,000 passed tax-free, completely shielding the vast majority of the everyday population. I'd seen lesser families worth $100,000 or $200,000 get hit. Their estate tax bills were just a few thousand, entirely manageable. A sting, not a fatal blow. But for Madam Edith, inheriting millions in Biltmore property, the financial math turned absolutely brutal. 10% of $5 million meant $500,000 in hard cash, due within 12 months. Washington didn't care that the master's wealth was locked entirely in land, stone, and imported art. The suits didn't care that liquidating these assets quickly would absolutely destroy their true value. They calculated the tax on the total estate, demanding hard currency. The law offered zero mercy for unique architecture. If someone inherited a factory, they could just sell it. Buyers line up for profitable businesses. If you inherited stocks and bonds, Wall Street markets existed for those. But look at our situation. Inheriting the largest private residence in America, stranded in rural North Carolina. You and I both know there's no buyer for a 250-room chateau. That market simply didn't exist. It created a beautifully twisted trap. The ledger might claim millions for taxation, but the estate would never fetch that. Madam Edith faced an inheritance tax built on phantom numbers, completely detached from what a forced liquidation would actually bring in if she sold. She'd owe taxes on wealth we couldn't touch, at prices no buyer would ever pay. The revenue boys knew this perfectly well. Hell, they were banking on it. Their new tax was a weapon meant to shatter grand fortunes by forcing us to liquidate. If the mistress had to sell 80,000 acres to survive, that was exactly what the progressives wanted. Our pristine lands would bleed out to loggers and developers. The master's concentrated empire would simply vanish. The Vanderbilt legacy would crumble. Mission accomplished. To Washington, this was a brilliant strategy. It effectively executed dynastic wealth. It stuffed federal coffers. It scattered prime property to the wind. The fact that it demolished everything Mr. George spent his life building meant absolutely nothing to them. They claimed the law hit everyone equally. If you couldn't afford the tax on your inheritance, you chopped up the estate and sold it. Ruthlessly simple. We saw it for what it was: daylight robbery masked as taxation. Mr. George already paid income tax to buy this land, plus his yearly property taxes on the estate. Now, the state demanded another massive ransom, just for the privilege of leaving his own home to his grieving widow. It felt like a heist, but our outrage meant absolutely nothing. The law held firm. The 16th Amendment was fully constitutional. Congress pushed the 1913 Revenue Act through, and President Wilson signed it. This new tax was legal, it was armed, and it was marching straight toward Biltmore's gates. Within months, federal agents would arrive to appraise everything our master had left behind. They would calculate the debt, and Madam Edith would have to pay it or butcher the estate, piece by piece, until Washington was satisfied. She had no political armor to fight the law itself. No judge would save us. Her only tactical move was fighting the property valuation. If those agents priced Biltmore at $10 million, my mistress was completely ruined. The hit would top $500,000, 5 times the hard cash we had on hand. We'd have to carve up massive chunks of the land immediately. But if she could grind that number down, arguing this unique home needed special rules, if our lawyers found a tactical loophole to slash the bill, she just might survive. The war was starting. The full weight of the United States government versus one grieving widow fighting for our home. America invented a ruthless new way to strip wealth, and they were marching on Asheville to collect. Madam Edith buried her husband just 5 months after that cursed law passed. Now, she'd spend years in the trenches, fighting off bureaucrats eager to raid everything the master left behind. Let's pause here, because this tax nearly broke us entirely. Chapter 4. The IRS invades Asheville. Those federal assessors rolled up in the summer of 1914, barely 4 months post-funeral. 3 men in dark suits, gripping leather briefcases and clipboards, stepped off the Asheville train. They hired a motor car and headed straight for our gates. Federal agents from the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the ruthless men who would eventually become the modern IRS. Their mission was surgical: walk our halls, scrutinize every single asset, slap a dollar value on Madam's inheritance, and hand her the final brutal bill. I stood at the main entrance when they demanded access. Madam Edith was warned. The lawyers made it crystal clear she couldn't just lock the doors. The law demanded absolute cooperation. Blocking their path meant heavy penalties, maybe even criminal charges for my mistress. So she ordered me to open the heavy doors, and I assigned staff to shadow their every move. We knew this estate assessment would drag on for weeks. The suit started with the mansion itself, pacing out rooms, logging our construction materials, and dragging their fingers across the high-end finishes. They stared up at our 70-foot banquet hall ceilings. They scoured the library's 10,000 volumes, the tiled indoor pool, the basement bowling alley, and even our private gymnasium. Every single inch got documented, measured, and priced. They even brought in outside hired guns. A specialized art appraiser arrived just to scrutinize our paintings. Renoir, Whistler, Sargent. I watched them photograph, authenticate, and price every piece. The tapestries in our halls received the exact same cold treatment. 16th century Flemish thread, pieces that museums would absolutely kill for. That appraiser checked auction logs to guess what they'd fetch if Madam faced a forced sale. But our furniture was a logistical nightmare. The master bought those pieces straight out of French chateaux and Italian palaces. He bought entire rooms, tore them down, shipped them across the ocean, and rebuilt them right inside our wall. Tell me, how do you price a Louis XV bedroom set pulled straight from Versailles? What's the market rate for Renaissance Revival pieces that literally don't exist anywhere else? The suits just guessed. putting conservative estimates on clear provenance and totally blind guesses when they were clueless. Our library burned days of their time, 10,000 volumes, stacked heavily with impossibly rare first editions. They shipped in a New York book dealer who camped out for a week, appraising everything. He sifted through our first edition of Don Quixote, ancient medieval manuscripts, illuminated texts, and books signed by literal legends. We watched them tally every single book. Outside, more of these men were sizing up our grounds. 125,000 acres of pristine North Carolina mountains. Untouched timber stretching for miles. Government forestry men marched through our woods. They estimated board feet per acre, calculating exactly what the master's timber could fetch at market. They scrutinized our farms, putting separate price tags on the soil. Water rights, mineral deposits, roads. For us on staff, the invasion felt humiliating. Complete strangers paced through Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedroom, rummaging through her private closets. They logged her dresses, her gems, even the late Mr. Vanderbilt's keepsakes. Nothing remained sacred. If it held value, these men insisted on counting it. The federal law demanded absolute transparency. Concealing anything meant prison. I saw young Miss Cornelia watching from the upper landing as they raided her home. Barely 14, the poor girl couldn't grasp why suited agents were tallying our dining silver and snapping pictures of her father's beloved canvases. Madam tried explaining the law to her. We had to comply. But making a child accept why outsiders held the right to inventory her entire life? Nearly impossible. We below stairs found the ordeal sickening. These federal men treated Biltmore like a storage depot, not a home. They shoved our heavy furniture to measure floors. They drilled us on operations. Exactly how much coal did we burn every year? What did we get paid? How many fields were active? Our head butler gave tight answers and dodged the rest, but those agents never quit probing. They wielded their federal badges like weapons. 3 weeks later, these taxmen finally boxed up their initial findings. They kept the final tally hidden from us. That official paperwork would go to Madam's lawyers, but the sheer gravity of their audit was already echoing through our halls. They had inspected every spoon, priced out every acre. The upcoming bill would be massive, maybe enough to ruin us. Before they finally left, Mrs. Vanderbilt cornered their lead man in the great library. She demanded to know the final figure. He dodged the exact number, but he smugly hinted our estate was worth vastly more than her own legal team had projected. He wagered the house alone hit $2 million. The vast forests, several million more. The furnishings, another million easily. I overheard them whispering that her final valuation could shatter $8 or $9 million. The arithmetic was terrifying. 10% of $9 million meant a $900,000 tax bill. Madam only held $100,000 in cash. Even selling our timber right away, even auctioning the master's fine art, she could never scrape together $900,000 before the government's deadline. Madam would be forced to surrender the land. Massive, sprawling tracts of it, tens of thousands of acres. Mr. Vanderbilt's dream of a self-sustaining woodland empire was about to be butchered for tax money. The men finally drove off, their briefcases stuffed with our secrets. They headed back to Washington to type up their ruinous report. The official price tag would hit us within months. Walk in her shoes for a second. Madam had just 1 year to dig up $900,000, 12 months to pick which pieces of our home to sacrifice. Once they were gone, I saw her sitting alone in the library, just staring at the 10,000 volumes those men had coldly counted. The physical invasion was finished, but the real danger was just beginning. Washington had stripped bare her privacy, demanding she pay a ransom just to keep what her own husband had built. This attack wasn't merely financial. It felt deeply personal. Like the state was mocking her, claiming she didn't deserve our estate, telling her to grovel for whatever scraps they let her keep. But outrage wouldn't pay the bill. The statutes were carved in stone. Those agents were just following orders. This brutal estate tax was entirely legal, constitutional, and fully loaded. Mrs. Vanderbilt couldn't afford tears. She needed a battle plan. Our lawyers had to attack their math, proving you cannot slap standard market prices on a masterpiece. Her legal team desperately needed a loophole, because if that final tax demand stayed near $900,000, we were going to lose the legacy Mr. Vanderbilt built. The tax agents hit Asheville hard, and they demanded a fortune. Let's look at how we fought back. Madam hired the most ruthless tax lawyers money could possibly buy. Her head lawyer traveled down from a heavy-hitting New York firm. He brought 2 sharp associates along, claiming they were experts in this brand-new estate tax nightmare. Honestly, nobody really knew what they were doing. This federal law had only been bleeding people dry since October of 1913. These suited men were improvising, crafting legal defense tactics no courtroom had ever seen. Their opening strike? Demanding a formal showdown with the Internal Revenue bosses. That $8 to $9 million guess was completely absurd. Our lawyers argued those agents had inflated the price of every single doorknob. The government's math relied on buyers who didn't exist. Their methods were garbage. Madam's team demanded a punishing, line-by-line audit of their numbers, and they won it. We watched their 3-part strategy unfold. First, attack the mansion's value. Second, gut their land prices. Third, fight the staggering tag on our interior furnishings. If they could just shave 20 or 30% off that ridiculous total, the final penalty would shrink by hundreds of thousands of dollars. For us, that meant the difference between keeping our jobs and boarding up the windows. The main house was their primary target. Assessors slapped a $2 million label on it, citing raw stone and mortar costs. Our counsel called that pure fiction. Sure, the master spent a fortune building it. But what was its actual street value? Who exactly was going to buy a 250-room fortress in rural North Carolina? Nobody. The market simply wasn't there. You can't compare sales when nothing like Biltmore exists. The actual fair market price, which the tax law strictly demanded, was drastically lower than the raw building costs. Our lawyers dragged in architectural witnesses who swore under oath that massive, unique estates usually sold for pennies on the dollar. This grand palace, built entirely for our master's whims, wasn't exactly an easy thing to sell. I overheard the appraisers say our Biltmore house would fetch $1 million at best, barely half of what the government taxmen claimed it was worth. But the estate grounds? That was much trickier. We had 125,000 acres of untouched forest. Prime timber. Lumber barons would carve it up gladly. The government men priced it at $40 an acre, eyeing the rich wood and current market rates. That meant a $5 million valuation. Madam's lawyers swarmed the library, attacking that number relentlessly. First, the lawyers argued you couldn't dump that much land at once without tanking the market. Flooding the local sawmills with all our timber would shatter the price per acre. The taxmen wanted top dollar for every inch, which was utter nonsense. Plus, as we staff knew, those rugged mountains were brutally hard to reach. Logging up their costs a fortune, the real profit per acre was tiny. And Master George had dedicated huge chunks to conservation science, meaning no one could cut trees anyway. So, Madam's attorneys countered with $3 million, a far cry from $5 million. They insisted $3 million was cold reality, not some government fantasy. But the federal men refused to yield. The endless bickering dragged on for agonizing months. Those tax collectors had zero reason to compromise. Every dollar they let slide meant less money for Washington. They fought us on every single detail. Walk these grand halls with me. See the paintings? That was the hardest part. How do you argue the price of a Renoir masterpiece when gallery records back up a $50,000 tag? But those clever lawyers found an angle. They argued the tax should reflect a desperate fire sale, not a gallery showcase. If the mistress had to pawn her fine art overnight to pay Washington, she'd never get top dollar. Panic selling destroys value. They claimed the estate tax must reflect what an anxious widow could actually grab in a rush, not some perfect, patient auction scenario. The government agents sneered at that. The law demanded fair market value, and they absolutely demanded it. Fair market meant a calm exchange between willing men on a completely normal day. Madam's panic didn't make the silver or canvas any less precious. If she dumped Biltmore treasures for pennies, that was her problem. The tax bill ignored her distress entirely and focused strictly on the total fortune. Below stairs, we heard the whispers. The lawyers were draining hundreds of dollars weekly. Every closed-door meeting and typed document drained Madam Edith's purse further. She was paying expensive men just for the chance to afford the government's crushing bill. It was an absolute trap, but the poor woman had no alternative. Without those hounds fighting for her, Washington would crush the estate completely with a fatal bill. By late 1914, this silent war had raged for 6 exhausting months. The Tax Bureau threw us a tiny bone, dropping the value to $7 million from the original 8 or 9. Our legal team swore it would still bankrupt us and kept pushing back. But the state men stood firm. Politicians in Washington wanted to squeeze famous society families for every possible dime. Taking down a Vanderbilt was a massive trophy. Blinking now would ruin their reputation. I watched Madam's cash simply vanish, while men in suits argued over ledgers. Their staggering legal fees had already devoured tens of thousands. Meanwhile, running this massive household cost $50,000 annually, cash we no longer had. Her meager $100,000 reserve was bleeding out incredibly fast. We staff knew she'd have to sell things soon, no matter what the lawyers promised. Her head attorney finally brought news in early 1915. The finest outcome they could squeeze out was a $6 to $6.5 million valuation. That meant handing over $600,000 to $650,000 in taxes. A devastating blow to the house, surely, but better than the $900,000 nightmare. To secure that deal, Madam would have to surrender, accept the federal math, stop fighting the small battles, and only strike where her armor was thickest. The only other option was full litigation. She could reject the treaty entirely, drag Washington into a courtroom, and pray a judge took pity on her. But a trial would freeze us for years. Unpaid taxes would spawn massive penalties and crippling interest, with zero promise she'd actually emerge victorious. The inheritance laws were brand new and unpredictable. A judge could easily side with the tax collectors and demand the maximum. Going to trial was a blind gamble the mistress simply couldn't risk. So she laid down her sword. Spring 1915, a year after the master passed, they pegged our beautiful estate at $6.5 million. The final bill was a staggering $650,000, due immediately. After settling the lawyer tabs, Madam had maybe $30,000 left in the bank. You can guess what happened next. She needed $620,000 fast, leaving her exactly one desperate option: sell our land, giant bleeding pieces of it. The glorious empire Master George spent his whole life building was about to be butchered, tract by tract, just to satisfy Washington's brutal ledger. Those lawyers fought hard, I'll give them that. They slashed the tax debt by a cool $250,000 compared to the darkest predictions, but the shadow remained. They couldn't legally argue our rare home was completely exempt, nor could they trick the agents into taking small installments. The new laws were ironclad. The master's legacy owed 10%. Madam had to produce that cash, even if it meant tearing apart the exact paradise she was defending. A partial win in the courts simply wasn't going to save us. Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. The great offloading began during the cruel summer of 1915. Madam's advisors mapped out our most valuable forests. They picked the distant borders, the places heavy with ancient wood, the exact plots those greedy lumber outfits would snatch up in a heartbeat. The very first quiet talks involved local sawmills begging to bring their axes in immediately. Then Washington stepped up with the largest offer. Now, picture this final blow. The fresh United States Forest Service wanted huge tracts of the Appalachians. They asked Madam for 86,700 acres, offered $5 an acre, $433,500 total. The offer was an insult, barely covering the value of the raw timber. But Madam Edith needed cash immediately to satisfy those tax collectors, and the government smelled blood. They gave her a brutal ultimatum. She had no choice but to take it. We watched that Forest Service deal close in 1915. 86,700 acres the master spent years gathering. Land he meant to run as a perfect working forest. Suddenly, it just became Pisgah National Forest. The state stole a bargain. Madam got enough hard cash to cover most of her tax debts, but she lost almost everything Mr. Vanderbilt had built. That sale brought in $433,500, but the taxman demanded $650,000. She was still over $200,000 short. More of our land had to go just to cover the balance, the lawyers, and our daily operating costs, which never stopped. Over the following months, more acreage went up for sale. We watched smaller parcels get handed over to timber crews and private buyers. Each deal brought in a few $1,000s. Each signature bled us further. The master's original 125,000 acres kept shrinking. By the time those crushing taxes and fees were finally settled, Madam Edith had auctioned off the vast majority of the master's land. We were left with a fraction of his dream. Just enough acreage to maintain the house, the gardens, and the immediate grounds. Enough to keep up the illusion of a grand estate. But not enough to keep Mr. Vanderbilt's forestry experiments alive, or his dream of harvesting timber while protecting the land for tomorrow. We had watched Mr. Pinchot map out those forest management plans, the very first in America. Listen to me, those plans meant nothing once they chopped up the land. The financial hit was brutal, but losing the master's vision broke our hearts. Mr. Vanderbilt didn't build Biltmore just to live in a palace. He wanted to prove that real American wealth could be used for more than just blind greed. That a landowner could practice true conservation, managing resources properly, proving that profit and preservation could actually survive together. Our estate was meant to be a living example of proper land stewardship. Instead, the government's tax law turned it into a brutal, forced fire sale. Madam Edith understood perfectly. She knew selling the forest meant surrendering everything the master loved beyond these walls, but they left her no other way out. The state demanded cold, hard cash. The only thing she could liquidate fast enough was the dirt itself. So we watched it go, piece by piece, until they were satisfied. The art collection was next. We had to take down several beloved paintings to raise the extra funds. I won't list exactly what we crated up, but taking them down hurt. The master spent decades building this collection, choosing every single piece, rivaling the finest museums in the world. Now his treasures were being shipped off to cover debts. The rare book collection took the exact same hit. Strangely dressed dealers prowled our library, tagging items for sale. I watched his most valuable volumes get carted off to auction, one book at a time. The Grand Library was gutted. It still looked impressive to guess, but its true soul was gone. Then the furniture and the decorative pieces went next. Not the massive pieces that anchored the rooms, but secondary items we could quietly slip away without making the interiors look stripped bare. Every sale bought us time, but left empty spaces on our walls. By late 1916, 2 years after his passing, Madam had finally paid the taxes, the lawyers, and our daily wages. But our beautiful home had been fundamentally gutted. The vast majority of our lands were gone. The art was diminished, the library depleted, and the master's fine furnishings scattered away. What we sweep and polish today is still magnificent, but it's only a ghost of what Mr. Vanderbilt actually built. You have to understand, the bills didn't shrink. It still cost $50,000 to run Biltmore, regardless of how much land we had left outside. We servants still needed paying. The furnaces still needed coal. The gardens demanded daily sweat. But now, she had hardly any land left to generate revenue. Our remaining farms brought in some cash, but nowhere near the master's original projections. From my post, I could see Madam realizing she was utterly trapped. She survived the immediate ambush, but the long-term math was a death sentence. The family's liquid cash was basically completely gone. The leftover grounds just couldn't earn enough. Our daily operating costs eclipsed what the estate produced. She was bleeding money every year, with zero way to patch the hole. Eventually, she'd have to sell more heirlooms or find some miracle. This was the brutal legacy of that government estate tax. It wasn't just a single check. It was a violent dismantling that permanently crippled what we could save. Washington took its massive bite in 1915 and 16. Now, sheer time and bad math would keep eroding us. Madam Edith would spend the next 15 years fighting in the trenches just to stop total ruin. I'd watch her sit in the library, staring out at what remained. The master had been gone 2 years. In that short time, she'd sacrificed most of his empire just to keep a roof over our heads. And sitting there in 1916, she knew the war was far from over. It was only just beginning. The question was if she could somehow keep us afloat, or if the slow bleeding would continue until we had nothing left but an empty house and the ghosts of his grand vision. Let's review the final settlement, what Washington actually stripped from us. The very last payment cleared in March of 1916, almost exactly 2 years after we buried him. The Revenue Bureau stamped their receipt for $650,000. Their vile tax was finally satisfied. The grueling legal battle was officially done. Madam Vanderbilt had saved our Biltmore house, but the cost was quite literally everything else. The final accounting was simple and absolutely devastating to witness. Mr. Vanderbilt had gathered 125,000 acres. After the government's forced liquidations, only a tiny sliver survived. This house stood strong, alongside our gardens, the conservatory, the closest farms, and the woods we could see from the windows. But everything past that tree line was simply gone. The vast wilderness Mr. George envisioned as a model of conservation was gone, sold off just to satisfy a massive federal tax bill. Inside the house, those of us who served here saw the losses clearly. The walls still held paintings, yes, but the true masterworks were gone. We still dusted thousands of volumes in the library, yet the rarest manuscripts and signed first editions quietly auctioned off. We still polished French and Italian furniture, but the grand pieces Mr. George brought from European chateaus had vanished. What remained was still breathtaking, but what was missing was entirely irreplaceable. Madam Edith's immediate financial crisis was resolved. The estate tax was paid, legal fees settled. We weren't facing imminent foreclosure, but we servants knew she wasn't truly secure either. Her cash reserves were essentially wiped out. For 2 years, we watched her convert everything to money. Running this historic property still cost about $50,000 a year. Income was modest. She was operating on a quiet deficit, one that would slowly eat whatever value remained. She trimmed our staff where she could. But this massive house demanded heavy maintenance, so the cuts could only go so far. Still, the outer gardeners were let go. The expert foresters who worked on sustainable timber management were dismissed, simply because the Vanderbilt forest itself had been sold out from under us. Firing our friends saved some funds, but nowhere near enough to bridge the massive operating gap. Little Miss Cornelia was 16 in 1916. She watched her mother battle the government for 2 years. We saw her watch the holdings vanish piece by piece. She learned early that wealth isn't permanent and property can always be seized. The state could just take what it wanted if you lacked the cash. To her, these weren't just abstract ideas. It was brutal reality that shaped how she'd handle her inheritance. Madam Edith survived that crippling estate tax, but she certainly hadn't won. The Revenue Bureau extracted their $650,000. The progressive reformers who engineered the tax got exactly the result they wanted. The legendary Vanderbilt fortune was crippled. The wealth was fractured. Our massive private holdings were broken up, with huge portions surrendered straight into public hands. For the government men, the new system worked flawlessly. From Madam Edith's view, she kept the jewel but lost the crown. The main Biltmore house stood magnificent and intact. But Mr. George meant it to be more than a giant home. We were supposed to be a working demonstration of enlightened land management, a sustainable private forest for other wealthy owners to study. Without those vast surrounding lands, we were just an expensive structure up in the mountains. Impressive, but entirely hollow. Walk these halls with me. You might ask the exact same questions she did. Could she maintain us on such limited income? The ledgers said absolutely not. She could juggle the deficit for a few years maybe, but eventually options would dry up, more art would depart. More books would be crated up. Portions of our remaining land would face liquidation. The slow decay would win, unless something radical shifted. What shifted was Madam Edith's fire. She completely refused inevitable defeat. She ran us with ruthless efficiency. We only bought necessities. She found clever ways to bring in cash, even renting out certain rooms for special society events. We sold our farm produce locally. Timber rights on the remaining woods were strictly licensed out. Every scrap of income, no matter how small, helped close the bleeding gap between our property costs and revenue. For 13 intense years, from 1916 to 1929, she held that precarious balance. We kept the house immaculate. The grounds stayed perfectly beautiful. Miss Cornelia grew up, married, and had babies. Biltmore still functioned as the private sanctuary of an elite American family, but the peace was fragile. One collapsed roof, one failed harvest, or one sudden crisis could plunge us straight back into forced sales and ruin. Then came 1929. The market crashed that October. The Great Depression hit, and Madam Edith realized surviving that massive tax bill was just the warm-up act. The real war was beginning. The battle that would finally decide if Biltmore could survive as a true family home was upon us. Taxes ate our outer lands in 2 years. Now this economic depression threatened everything else. Edith had to look at solutions far more radical than just hawking paintings or soil. She was forced to consider the absolute unthinkable. Think about it, charging strangers admission just to walk through our private halls. Chapter 8. The grim depression that forced our final, heartbreaking surrender. The market collapsed on October 24, 1929, Black Thursday. Incredible fortunes just evaporated overnight. Major banks failed. Businesses locked their doors. Within weeks, the whole American economy was plunging. For most families, the Depression brought immediate unemployment and brutal poverty. For Edith Vanderbilt, it meant the total destruction of the fragile stability we had bled to build. She was 55 years old then. For 13 years, she held Biltmore together with iron discipline and clever revenue tactics. Our farms made money. The timber sales brought hard cash. She managed to keep our massive operating costs tied to what the estate could actually earn. We lived on a razor's edge, but it worked. The Depression wiped that balance out in months. Our farms couldn't sell anything. The locals were broke. The agricultural markets entirely collapsed as demand vanished. What used to be a steady stream of thousands annually became practically worthless overnight. We watched crops rot in the fields. Shipping them cost more than the profit. Our timber values completely plummeted. Lumber mills stopped buying because construction was dead. Building ground to a halt as credit vanished. The forest zones Madam Edith had carefully harvested for income became entirely unsellable. You and I know trees only have value if someone pays for the wood. In the early 1930s, absolutely nobody was buying. Madam's remaining investments collapsed next. Her bonds defaulted. The dividend checks we relied on simply stopped arriving. Banks holding Madam's accounts suffered panic runs. Several collapsed completely. The modest cushion she spent 13 long years rebuilding simply vanished. She was back to the nightmare of 1916. Only now the whole economy was burning. No buyers existed for anything we could sell, yet those massive property taxes remained unchanged. North Carolina still demanded payment regardless of the panic. The annual bill arrived whether Madam had funds or not. Insurance premiums bled us too. Utility costs kept hitting us. We had to heat this massive house through winter or the pipes would burst. She could dismiss some of us, delay estate maintenance, and slash expenses. But Madam couldn't erase basic operational costs. By 1930, she faced the exact brutal arithmetic that almost ruined her 14 years prior. Fixed operational costs remained, while her income approached zero. Our liquid reserves were completely drained, and this time, nothing was left to sell. The vast acreage was gone. Our finest artwork was gone. The master's rarest books were gone. Madam couldn't liquidate her way out of this siege. We had absolutely nothing left to sell that would generate enough cash to save us. The lawyers presented her options: close Biltmore entirely, fire all of us, board the windows, and wait. That would stop the financial bleeding, but it guaranteed this magnificent house would rot away. Without our daily maintenance and winter heat, a grand structure this size would suffer catastrophic damage within years. Boarding it up saved cash now, but destroyed Biltmore eventually. Her second tactical option was selling the house itself. A hotel group or resort developer might actually buy it, despite the depression. But selling meant Madam would be surrendering Mr. Vanderbilt's legacy forever. Everything she battled for since 1914 would be wiped out. Miss Cornelia would inherit nothing, and the Vanderbilt name would vanish from these grounds. Madam found that completely unacceptable. A third strategic option emerged: opening our doors to paying tourists. We floated this idea before and instantly killed it. Vanderbilts do not charge admission. Elite families simply don't turn their homes into public attractions. It was entirely beneath the family, a humiliating public admission that they had fallen so far they had to monetize their own dining room. But let me tell you, by late 1930, Madam was out of alternatives. The Depression killed every other revenue stream. Yet tourism might actually save us. People still traveled, taking fewer, cheaper vacations. And our local Asheville was already a known destination. Touring America's largest private residence might draw crowds despite the crash. If we could generate modest admission revenue from steady foot traffic, it might just cover our daily operating costs. Madam did not make this tactical choice quickly or easily. Madam consulted Miss Cornelia, now 30, with her own children. The young heiress understood our grim reality. Without a new income stream, Biltmore was totally doomed. Letting the public inside was deeply humiliating, but losing the estate entirely was unthinkable. They agreed. In 1930, we opened Biltmore's heavy doors to paying visitors. The announcement absolutely stunned high society. America's most prominent family was charging commoners to walk their halls. It was a massive scandal. Wealthy elites whispered about Madam's tragic fall from grace. Some called her desperate tactic utterly disgraceful. A few realized it was pure survival. For us staff, logistics were a nightmare. The first floor opened, plus second-floor bedrooms if we stood guard. Madam's family retreated to private quarters on the third floor. We immediately had to recruit and train tour guides. Our security protocols tightened. We adjusted insurance for public access, built new visitor facilities, and quickly cleared areas for parking. We had to transform this quiet private home into a high-volume tourist attraction, all while Madam and her family slept upstairs. Strangers arrived that year, handing us admission cash right at the front door. We marched them through the grand entrance hall with its soaring ceiling, the massive banquet hall where Madam once entertained, the grand library holding thousands of remaining books, the winter garden with its exotic orchids. Each tour lasted an hour, ending at a makeshift shop selling postcards. Honestly, their reactions were quite mixed. Some tourists were absolutely thrilled to breach America's grandest fortress. Others felt awkward trespassing through a house where our family still lived. My staff had to manage awestruck admirers alongside rude snoops who dared to ask intrusive questions about Madam's personal financial ruin. Awkward, yes, but it worked. Biltmore started attracting steady foot traffic. Admission cash wasn't enormous, but it was highly consistent. Those dollars piled up week by week. Combined with our severe budget cuts, that cash kept Biltmore maintained and kept us essential servants employed. Biltmore's walls held through 1930, 1931, and every single year after that. Madam did the unthinkable. She opened the master's private palace to absolute strangers, charging them cash just to walk through our exclusive entertaining spaces. She converted Mr. Vanderbilt's sacred monument into a tourist business, but she saved it. The estate survived the Great Depression simply by surrendering its elite exclusivity to the masses. You and I watched the paying public save our private estate. Chapter 9. Madam saved Biltmore by surrendering it. Letting tourists inside back in 1930 was supposed to be a desperate, temporary survival measure. Madam firmly believed that when the Depression broke and the economy recovered, we would lock those heavy doors and return to private high society. Madam was wrong. That tactical breach was irreversible. Once we let common tourists inside, there was simply no going back. Our admission revenue climbed steadily throughout the 30s. Word traveled fast that America's grandest private fortress was finally breached. Newspapers wrote massive features. Famous travel guides started recommending our estate. Step into the servants' hall with me. We watched visitors arrive from everywhere, hungry to see how our Gilded Age masters lived. What Mrs. Vanderbilt started for survival became a massive operation. By the mid-30s, we were managing thousands of tourists a year. Those ticket sales brought in more cash than Madam had pulled from every other venture throughout the entire 1920s. Our farms, the timber operations, the old investments, none of our back-breaking labor produced what those tourists paid. She found the only tactical way to keep this massive operation running. Outsiders were paying to keep the lights on when the family's private funds dried up. Mrs. Vanderbilt stayed right here while we ran the place like a museum. A bizarre deployment, but we made it work. Strangers roamed the lower floors all day long. The family retreated to the third floor. Suddenly, they were using our back staircases and servant passages, dodging the crowds like ghosts in their own home. We were basically dusting a living museum. Awkward for everyone, sure, but beats getting fired and watching the estate fall. Miss Cornelia had married John Cecil, the second son of some British noble family. They had two boys, Master George and Master William, who would eventually save our jobs. The whole family stayed with Madam, raising the next generation right where Mr. Vanderbilt started. The tourist operation demanded relentless oversight. We had to be retrained completely just to handle the heavy crowds. We scrubbed floors constantly to survive thousands of boots tearing through here. Our security guards watched for thieves without looking like guards. Insurance premiums spiked. Advertising drained the budget. Keeping a historic mansion running as a public attraction was a brutal shift, but we pulled it off. By the late 30s and early 40s, our paychecks were steady for the first time since Mr. Vanderbilt died. The Great Depression finally backed off. World War II fueled an economic bounce. Visitors kept rolling in, making our estate a permanent, famous destination. Madam's desperate, wild gamble had become our permanent battle plan. Mrs. Vanderbilt passed away right here in the house on December 21st, 1958. She was 85. We watched her live 44 hard years as a widow, outlasting her short 16-year marriage to the master. She battled the feds, survived selling off our lands, pushed through the Depression, and saved our massive home by letting the whole world inside. The fortress she held together passed down to Miss Cornelia in 1958, along with the ticket lines that kept us employed. But down in the trenches, the daily operations were run by her boys, George and William. They had been giving us orders for years already. The young masters clearly understood what their grandmother had achieved and the grueling daily operations required to continue. The boys took total command when Madam died. They knew this giant estate was finished as a private home. Our only way forward was corporate. They locked it in, turning our workplace into the Biltmore Company. The family became shareholders, and this giant stone house became the main asset. Flipping from a family manor into a formal corporation was absolutely vital for our legal standing and tax survival. Death taxes were still a massive threat to the inheritance. By treating the property as a commercial business, the masters could argue its financial value entirely differently. This huge place wasn't valued as a billionaire's private retreat anymore. It was priced purely on the ticket revenue our staff could generate every single day. That tax distinction saved everything. Under the Cecil brothers' command, our daily workload expanded way beyond running simple tourist walkthroughs. We launched new revenue missions over the years. We eventually started bottling wine, putting the estate's original outbuildings back into heavy rotation. Soon we were hosting massive weddings and high-end corporate events. Every single dollar funded the brutal cost of maintaining a 250-room beast. That frantic survival tactic Mrs. Vanderbilt launched back in 1930 became the master blueprint for saving historic properties across the entire country. Rival mansions quickly copied our survival playbook. Places like the Breakers and Hearst Castle only survived by letting the commoners inside. Everyday ticket buyers were bailing out the massive palaces these wealthy bloodlines could no longer afford. The castles built to keep people out only survived by dropping the gates. Madam never would have ordered this retreat if she had any other choice. We watched her fight it for years, but cornered between losing Mr. Vanderbilt's entire legacy or letting strangers track dirt inside, she opened the front doors. That single call saved our jobs and the estate for generations. The stone fortress Mr. Vanderbilt raised in the 1890s survives today simply because his widow had the grit to execute the unthinkable. She sacrificed our privacy to save our home. A brutally ironic victory. Mr. George dropped $6 million to build a mountain fortress, hiding his family from high society and the filthy city crowds. He only ever wanted total isolation. He built a private paradise. Mrs. Vanderbilt kept it standing by shattering that isolation forever. She ushered in the very mobs he despised, selling access to his elite, hidden world. And through that sacrifice, she guaranteed his masterpiece would outlast them both by 100 years. Chapter 10. The Estate Today. Step up to the window with me now. Today we process over 1 million visitors a year. They swarm in buses and rentals, packing parking grids built for thousands. They buy tickets, grab headsets, and spend all day wandering through 250 rooms that we used to clean for just one single family. The private sanctuary Mr. Vanderbilt built for $6 million in the 1890s now pulls in tens of millions every year as a top tourist attraction. We are operating one of the most profitable historic sites in the country, and the Vanderbilt bloodline still signs our checks. That detail always stuns the guests. They assume massive properties like this eventually surrender to government control or charity foundations. But the estate remains in private hands, directed by the founder's descendants through the corporate office. Today, Master William Cecil's son runs the entire operation. The family lives off-site now, but they retain absolute control over our operations. Our survival here is a brutal, spectacular anomaly. Of the hundreds of grand mansions built during those golden years, barely any remain with their founding families. Mr. Vanderbilt's kin raised multiple palaces. That colossal Fifth Avenue estate in New York? Reduced to rubble. The breakers in Newport got handed off to a society. Marble House went the same way. Mr. Cornelius's original New York residence was completely wiped out. But Mr. George Washington Vanderbilt's Biltmore? It stands alone. We are the last major Vanderbilt estate still run by the family's bloodline. Let me tell you our secret. Biltmore went to work. Those other families clung to private luxury until their walls crumbled or got surrendered. When Madame Edith threw open our doors in 1930, she turned a bottomless pit of luxury into a working, profit-making machine. That harsh pivot kept our fires burning. The manors that stayed locked tight perished. We let the public in, and we survived. Our daily operations dwarf those early parlor tours now. We bottle hundreds of thousands of wine cases a year, bringing in serious operational capital. Staff manage endless weddings, board retreats, and concerts. We run hotels, kitchens, and retail shops on the grounds. Guests roam the property all weekend and never see it all. We operate a massive resort now, with the Master's historic house standing firm as the main draw. Hustling like this shields our Biltmore from the vicious estate tax that nearly broke us back in 1914. Because we run these grounds as a registered business, the tax collectors assess our value far differently than a mere private home. We generate steady cash, employ an army of loyal workers, and drive the local Asheville economy. That hard commercial reality provides financial armor that pure private indulgence simply could not offer. What felt like bitter defeat to the staff in 1930 became the ironclad legal shield keeping us employed generations later. The truth we learn below stairs is undeniable. No private fortune, however deep, can prop up Gilded Age excess forever. The gold that built these sprawling palaces was staggering. My employers, the Vanderbilts, sat among the wealthiest dynasties in American history. Yet even Vanderbilt vaults could not bankroll multiple fortresses across the generations. Once Washington started bleeding their inherited wealth, the ledgers turned red. That heavy estate tax hit its mark exactly as the politicians planned. It choked off the rise of true American royalty. The towering fortunes we served were shattered by inheritance levies and desperate estate liquidations. The Astors, Morgans, Carnegies, and our own Vanderbilts watched their hoarded wealth bleed out across dozens of heirs and ruthless government taxes. Today's heirs live comfortably, but they aren't kings anymore. The tax system worked, though the toll on our cultural history was brutal. Hundreds of breathtaking manors faced the wrecking ball simply because no family could afford the upkeep. Master builders forged wonders meant to stand for centuries, but they fell in decades when the endless money finally dried up. You and I both know those lost architectural marvels are gone forever. No one spends like that anymore. We only survived by shifting our entire strategy. Strangers with tickets replaced isolated luxury. Hard commerce replaced quiet consumption. The fortress Mr. George built for his peace now hosts millions. Letting the masses in saved our stone, but killed the dream. The master wanted total seclusion. He got a bustling tourist destination instead. The grand house lived, but the fantasy perished. Madame Edith understood that cold, necessary trade-off entirely. Staring down total ruin or swallowing her pride, she chose to bend. That tactical choice salvaged the core instead of surrendering it all. Our grand halls still stand because she let the world inside. Mr. Vanderbilt's architectural masterpiece endures only because his widow abandoned his isolation. This saga is a masterclass in what survives and why. The government decided through heavy tax laws that hoarding private wealth was a threat requiring destruction. That ruthless move shattered the financial bedrock keeping these sprawling estates afloat. Yet people still romanticize grand historic architecture and demand we preserve it. Those two forces violently clash against each other. You can't strip away a family's fortune and expect them to fund a palace that burns cash daily. The only tactical fix was letting everyone inside. The paying public funds the grand upkeep that private heirs simply cannot afford anymore. Ticket stubs replaced trust funds. We kept the grand roof over our heads by entirely flipping the mission. These walls don't hold a home anymore. Walk the halls with me. They're monuments to an era people envy but despise. Everyone wants to peek at the elite, but nobody wants them ruling us. Our Biltmore captures that bitter irony perfectly. Over 1 million strangers buy tickets yearly to walk through a sanctuary built to hide from crowds. They snap photos of private family quarters. They march through a stronghold designed to prove one man possessed more gold than a dozen towns. And the only reason they're allowed inside is because the very government that crushed my employer's wealth now slaps a historic landmark badge on our gates. Mr. Vanderbilt built our Biltmore to stand forever. He poured in fireproof steel, hired absolute master craftsmen, and burned through millions. Structurally, he won. We're solid a century later. Financially, he completely miscalculated the future. The endless mountain of cash needed to run this fortress privately simply couldn't survive those brutal 20th century tax raids. Madam Edith protected the stone by killing the privacy. It was the only tactical play left. The tax code that almost sank us in 1914 forged our defenses. That Great Depression panic of 1930 forced open the very business model keeping us paid today. The threats that nearly broke us forced a radical shift. That pivot was agonizing for the staff, but blind loyalty to the master's old vision would have doomed us all. Biltmore stands today not despite its transformation, but because of it.